So, you also see the same sort of thing happening with clouds. I'm going to move this a little bit quickly. The punchline here is just that this happened in this course of 5 days. This company that uses Amazon cloud computing had a tenfold scale up of their product. All of these changes, the measurement, experimentation, sharing, and replication, are enabled by information technology. That's part of what makes them possible. Furthermore, they reinforce each other. For instance, measurement is a great way of identifying correlations, but if you want to get at the causality that's underlying them, you want to be able to do experiments. And these experiments are more valuable if you can measure things precisely. And of course, being able to share what you learn makes it that much more valuable, and being able to replicate it. So while each of these innovations is momentous in and of itself, together they are synergistic and even more powerful. And furthermore, they form an identifiable sequence where companies experiment with new approaches, then they measure it more carefully, they share their findings, and then they replicate it, and then they go back and do the whole thing again. And this collectively is leading to a new way of doing R&D, and it's speeding up the pace of innovation and the pace of discovery. There's some lessons for managers that come from this. One is to recognize that we're in an environment where innovation is much more important and more of a source of competitive advantage. Two is that there's a set of technologies that can help with this. And three is that there's now an identifiable four-step process for managing this and doing it more rapidly. So be interested in taking your questions now. If you want to read more about some of these ideas, some of them are described in this book and a series of articles that I'm coming out with. But I think we still have a couple of minutes, some time for questions. If you have questions or comments on this, is this what you're seeing in your organizations? Or? Yep.
I think we learn a lot about behavioral economics from some of these experiments. You know,
yes.
We learn that people do respond to what side of the page
the box on the left versus the right, yeah.
The data must tell us or tell the firms that it's better to price at $10.99 rather than $11. And sometimes
even $10.99 versus $10, ironically.
Really? Oh,
yeah,
interesting.
Yeah. There's the power of the 9 is huge.
Wow. And also that shipping prices are often kind of hidden. Like from the third-party sellers.
How salient it is, exactly.
I have Prime, so it doesn't matter to me. But I wonder if you can comment on that, about how we as academics can think about our
Absolutely.
models.
So I think that I think it's not a coincidence that we have more of an appreciation for behavioral economics now, and that's partly because we can measure it in a way before. But it's the same thing for managers. I think there's a mindset change that, and I'll make the analogy both among academics and among managers, where it used to be that people would do a lot of analysis and planning and strategic thinking and come up with these things, and then they'd roll them out. Now it's much more of a rapid testing environment where you have a series of different hypotheses, and then you throw them out there and you try to quickly get the answers. So Jeff Wilkie, who I know you know as well as I do, told me that in some cases they can run experiments, and within one afternoon they have a statistically significant result coming back from the data, just because they have so many visitors. Now, that's kind of one extreme. More often, it's several weeks, and companies like Harrah's that are offline, it may be several months. But it's still a pretty rapid feedback loop. And the textbook economics gives you some great, 20,000-foot principles, that higher prices tend to have lower demand than lower prices. But some of those aren't always true. And I was surprised when people did these experiments that sometimes if you have something ending in 9, it's a signal that this is a bargain, and in some cases that can lead to more demand. And the only way to know for sure is to do empirical testing. So I think there's a change to a more scientific way of doing economics and a more scientific way of doing management. The reason we've had such progress in science and engineering, one of the reasons over the past couple of centuries, is that those disciplines have mastered the scientific method. But economists have not, to be frank, been very good at the scientific method. There hasn't been the real controlled experiment. We should listen to Gary Loveman, have a treatment group. People have done, very fancy things with instrumental variables and other ways to try to get at causality. But there's nothing better than a true controlled experiment. And finally, we're in a position of being able to do that. We have platforms where we can do it much more cheaply and easily. And the same thing with management. I think management is poised to advance much more rapidly in the next decade or two because we can do those kinds of controlled experiments rather than just relying on textbook principles. Other questions? So why don't we go over this side?
So your graphic on IT and productivity is very interesting. I'm wondering if you had any sort of outlier industries, and I'm thinking of provision of healthcare services as opposed to production of healthcare technologies.
Yeah.
Physician specialty groups, hospitals. Mm-hmm. Some of what we've heard today already, Brad Smith's comment about confidentiality and privacy seems to be counterproductive sometimes to gathering the information needed for the traditional manufacturer's definition of productivity.
It's much more difficult because of the measurement issues are tougher there. So I want to say about this chart, these are all relative to industry average. But if we took away the industry controls, this effect would be even more extreme because there's some industries where we have much more rapid productivity growth and also more IT intensity. Healthcare is a problem both for researchers and for managers because the measurement issues are so difficult that in most of these cases we can use sales as a good proxy for output, but you don't necessarily want to just measure how many dollars a hospital brings in as its measure of productivity. You really want to use quality adjusted life years or something like that. And those statistics are much harder to come by. You have to kind of do them typically diagnostic category by diagnostic category. People who've done that, like David Cutler, often find very significant effects. But there's a dichotomy between the technology that's used in some of the treatment areas versus the back office. And the administrative side of hospitals is, by and large, way behind other industries. And I think a lot of it is, frankly, because the measures aren't so good. So management, you can't manage what you can't measure generally. So you get a lot of inefficiencies in hospital administration and in healthcare delivery, and that's pretty different from what's happening with the production processes. Now, this may be ultimately what I'm describing may be a partial solution to it, because if we start being able to measure more precisely what's happening, then we should be able to pick up our management as well. And maybe in the next few years, as they introduce electronic health records and some of the other tools, we'll be able to get a better understanding of which practices work and which ones don't. As you mentioned, the big barriers are not technological. They are things, regulatory, privacy issues, and they are strategic. Companies sometimes don't want to share the information because then if they make their records too portable, then the patients can walk out the door. In Massachusetts, Massachusetts General Hospital and Brigham and Women's are both part of the Partners Health System, yet they don't share medical records. Why? Because they have separate profit centers. And you talk to them and they say, well, we have, our doctors have different idiosyncratic needs. But I don't think that's what's really driving it. I think that at some level, they're not very interested in having patients have that kind of portability because it would toughen competition. But I'm hopeful that the measurement will allow us to do a better job with that. Do we have time for one more question?
We don't. We actually have to move on. Thank you very much, Erik.
Okay.